Prologue, with the feelings of a father. The White House, Washington, winter 1832-33. It looked like war. In his rooms on the second floor of the White House, in the flickering light of candles and oil lamps, President Andrew Jackson was furious and full of fight. He had just been re-elected to a second term as America's 7th president, and South Carolina was defying him. He hated it, for he believed to his core that the state was about to destroy the nation. For Jackson, the crisis was not only political, it was personal. 450 miles down the Atlantic seaboard from Washington, in Charleston, radicals were raising an army to defend South Carolina's right to nullify federal laws it chose not to accept, the first step, Jackson believed, towards secession and the destruction of the Union. I expect soon to hear that a civil war of extermination has commenced, Jackson said, musing about arresting the Southern leaders and then hanging them. Gaunt but striking, with a formidable head of white hair, a nearly constant cough, a bullet lodged in his chest, Jackson, 65 years old that winter, stood 6'1" and weighed 140 pounds. Over a midday glass of whiskey in the White House with an old friend, Jackson pounded a table as he pondered the crisis. By the God of heaven, I will uphold the laws. Week after week, he threatened to field a powerful force, and he knew who should lead them. When everything is ready, I shall join them myself, Jackson said. At Boston's Faneuil Hall, Daniel Webster, the great Massachusetts senator, rallied to the president's defense, denouncing South Carolina's defiance in epic terms. It is nothing more nor less than resistance by force. It is disunion by force. It is secession by force. It is civil war. The danger was real, for there was nothing foreordained about the future of American democracy in the Jackson years. The nation itself, dating from the Declaration of Independence, was barely half a century old. Now, as Jackson began his 5th year in the White House, the United States might collapse into fratricidal conflict, and foreign powers, always a threat, watched with anticipation. In a private letter in the winter of 1833, Richard Wellesley, the Marquis Wellesley and elder brother of the Duke of Wellington, hoped for the dissolution of the American Confederacy, which I think would be a great benefit to the civilized world. Dispatching troops and a warship, the Natchez, to Charleston, Jackson, the general whose steadfastness in adversity and against the British in the War of 1812 had earned him the nicknames Old Hickory and the Old Hero, was determined to keep America together. He loved the Union with a consuming devotion. In the Radicals' camp, Robert Woodward Barnwell, a South Carolina congressman, passed along reports that Jackson was set on war if the state defied him. Nothing but blood will satisfy the old scoundrel, Barnwell said. Jackson's own vice president, John C. Calhoun, had resigned and taken up South Carolina's cause. Though the immediate issue was money, South Carolina felt oppressed by federal tariffs, which it wanted to lower. The real question, everyone knew, was about power and ultimately about slavery. If Jackson won the showdown, then Washington would be stronger and the South weaker, and a stronger Washington meant a greater threat to the future of what Calhoun called the peculiar domestic institution of the Southern states. Watching the crisis grow, Webster said, I am prepared any day to hear that matters have come to blows in Charleston. It was rumored that excited radicals in South Carolina were buying medals emblazoned John C. Calhoun, first president of the Southern Confederacy. And readers of the Columbia Telescope in the state capitol considered this fiery plea. The present is not a time for cold temporizing policy. This union must be dissolved. To save the country required strength, subtlety, and a sure sense of what the broader American public wanted. I will meet all things with deliberate firmness and forbearance, Jackson said, but woe to those nullifiers who shed the first blood. He would be patient, but he would do what it took. His blend of solicitude and sanction reflected his view that politics was at once clinical and human, driven by both principle and passions that he had to master and harness for the good of the whole. As president, Jackson believed he bore the duties of a father who alone carried the responsibility for protecting the nation. Jackson valued 2 things in life above all others, his country and his family. He saw little distinction between the two, and his instinct to fight and to defend both, to be a father twice over, drove him from his obscure birth in the Carolinas to the pinnacle of power. Orphaned at 14, Jackson never knew his own father, who died the year he was born. I have been tossed upon the waves of fortune, Jackson once said, and he spent his life seeking order amid chaos and authority among men. The Revolutionary War had claimed the lives of his mother and his brothers. Suffering those losses at such a young age, Jackson saw his life and the life of the country as one. America, he once said, was one great family. In a draft of his second inaugural address in 1833, he wrote, I feel in the depths of my soul that it is the highest, most sacred and most irreversible part of my obligation to preserve the union of these states, although it may cost me my life. The nation, then, played a decisive role in his emotional universe. Jackson carried an image of the Union around in his head, a vision of the United States and its people as an extension of his own clan in which he was alternately father and son. From childhood, Jackson was in search of a structure into which he could fit, find reassurance and stability, and come to control. In the midst of the crisis with South Carolina in the winter of 1832-33, in a draft of his proclamation on nullification to the people of that state, Jackson wrote, "I call upon you in the language of truth, and with the feelings of a father to retrace your steps." With the feelings of a father, Jackson's familial vision had intriguing implications for the life of the nation. For General Jackson, it meant that in battle he was fighting not for a distant cause but for the survival of his own kin. For President Jackson, it meant that there was little difference between the personal and the political. His was a White House roiled by intrigue, war, and sexual scandal, and it left a permanent mark on the nation. This book is not a history of the age of Jackson but a portrait of the man and of his complex relationships with the intimate circle that surrounded him as he transformed the presidency. The story of Jackson's life and of his White House years is of his long, unrelenting war to keep his family and his country safe, a long, unrelenting war that helped shape the way we live now. One of America's most important and most controversial presidents, Andrew Jackson, is also one of our least understood, recalled mainly as the scourge of the Indians or as the hero of the 1815 Battle of New Orleans. He is only dimly remembered in the popular imagination, too far out of mind to be instructive or intriguing. Yet of the great early presidents and founders, Andrew Jackson is in many ways the most like us. In the saga of the Jackson presidency, one marked by both democratic triumphs and racist tragedies, we can see the American character in formation and in action. To understand him and his time helps us to understand America's perennially competing impulses. Jackson's life and work, and the nation he protected and preserved, were shaped by the struggle between grace and rage, generosity and violence, justice and cruelty. The source of inspiration to Lincoln on the eve of the Civil War, revered by Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, and hailed by Harry Truman as one of the four greatest presidents. Along with Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, Jackson expanded the powers of the presidency in ways that none of his 6 predecessors had. He was the first president to come from the common people, not from an educated elite, and he never ceased to see himself as their champion. He was the first to build what we would recognize as a political party. He was the first to maintain a large circle of private advisors, what was called his kitchen cabinet, to help make policy. And he was the first to insist on the deference he thought due the chief executive as the only official elected by all the people. It was a distinction he believed made the White House, not Capitol Hill, the center of national power and national action. The country that Jackson presided over from 1829 to 1837 was smaller than one might think, surrounded by once and possibly future foreign foes. There were 24 states in 1828. Arkansas and Michigan would be admitted late in Jackson's presidency, with Florida coming in just before his death in 1845 and Texas not long after. The British had the nation hemmed into the north, and Canada, Britain, and Russia had claims to the Pacific Northwest. The Gulf of Mexico worried Jackson as an invasion route for a foreign power. Beyond the physical threats, Jackson saw more oblique but no less dangerous perils. Before Jackson, power tended toward the elites, whether political or financial. After Jackson, power was more diffuse, and government, for better and for worse, was more attuned to the popular will. He may not have consciously set out to leave such a legacy, but he made the case for democratic innovation and popular engagement in politics at a time when many in Washington would have preferred that the people play the role they were assigned at Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, as voters who cast their ballots and then allowed intermediary institution, from the state legislatures that elected U.S. senators to the Electoral College, which chose presidents, to make the real decisions. Jackson wanted to give the people a more dramatic part to play, and he rewrote the script of public life to give them one. It would be both glib and wrong to say that the age of Jackson is a mirror of our own time. The cultural, political, moral, and intellectual universe Jackson inhabited has to be viewed on its own terms. Still, there is much about him and about his America that readers in the early 21st century may recognize. His was an age of fascination with politics, patriotism, gossip, and religion. Both My Country, 'Tis of Thee and Amazing Grace took root in the popular culture during Jackson's presidency. The America of Andrew Jackson was a country that professed a love of democracy, but was willing to live within equality, that aimed for social justice, but was prone to racism and intolerance, that believed itself one nation but was narrowly divided and fought close election, and that occasionally acted arrogantly toward other countries while craving respect from them at the same time. He was the most contradictory of men. A champion of extending freedom and democracy to even the poorest of whites, Jackson was an unrepentant slaveholder. A sentimental man who rescued an Indian orphan on a battlefield to raise in his home, Jackson was responsible for the removal of Indian tribes from their ancestral lands. An enemy of Eastern financial elites and a relentless opponent of the Bank of the United States, which he believed to be a bastion of corruption. Jackson also promised to die, if necessary, to preserve the power and prestige of the central government. Like us in our America, Jackson and his America achieved great things while committing grievous sins. Jackson was the only American president to take a bullet in a frontier gunfight, and the only one who tried to assault his own would-be assassin. An uneducated boy from the Carolina backwoods, the son of Scots-Irish immigrants, he became a practicing lawyer, a public prosecutor, a U.S. attorney, a delegate to the founding Tennessee Constitutional Convention, a U.S. congressman, a U.S. senator, a judge of the state superior court, and a major general, first of the state militia and then of the U.S. Army. The glow of his victory over the British at New Orleans in 1815, as mythic a battle as Lexington and Concord, transformed him into a fabled figure. Popular songs were written about him. The anniversary of the victory, January 8th, was a national occasion for Jackson banquets and Jackson parades. There were darker moments, too. He had massacred Indians in combat, fought duels, and imposed martial law on New Orleans, imprisoning those who defied him. He had married the love of his life, Rachel Donaldson Robards, before she was divorced from her first husband. The scandal of his marriage stayed with him through the decades, and he believed that the stress of the charges of adultery and bigamy ultimately killed her. Commanding, shrewd, intuitive yet not especially articulate, alternately bad-tempered and well-mannered, Jackson embodied the nation's birth and youth. He came from virtually nothing, yet had married into, and helped define, Tennessee aristocracy. He could seem savage, yet he moved in sophisticated circles with skill and grace. In December 1814, with the Battle of New Orleans at hand, a leading hostess was disturbed to learn that her husband had invited Jackson to dinner. After warning her other guests about this wild man of the woods, the lady was stunned to find Jackson both elegant and charming. "Is this your backwoodsman?" her friends asked after Jackson left. "He is a prince." Jackson was fond of well-cut clothes, racehorses, dueling, newspapers, gambling, whiskey, coffee, a pipe, pretty women, children, and good company. One of his secretaries observed that there was more of the woman in his nature than in that of any man I ever knew, more of a woman's tenderness toward children, and sympathy with them. Depending on the moment, he could succumb to the impulses of a warlike temperament or draw on his reserves of unaffected warmth. Jackson spoke with the accent of a provincial in the capital, yet was discriminating in his choice of wines and favored Greek Revival architecture. He was a skilled operator, the consummate self-made man. As an orphan, Jackson adapted to shifting circumstances and cultivated the powerful. Dependent on others in his first years, largely his mother's extended family, cousins and uncle and aunts, he spent much of his life seeking both affection and deference. The roles Jackson chose to pursue and play, frontier lawyer, state judge, military commander, foster father, attentive uncle, American president, reflected this urge to be at once admired and in charge. He was gloomy when people left him, even for a short time, and he could be the most demanding of men, insisting that others bend their lives to his. His was an interesting kind of neediness, often intertwined with sincere professions of love and regard. But in the end, when a choice came down to what Jackson wanted or what anyone else wanted, Jackson's will, and no one else's, prevailed. And like his country, Jackson's family circle was riven with rivalries and veered between harmony and strife. In the long winter of 1832-33, staring down South Carolina, the president relied, as he always did, on his wife's circle for affection and company. Rachel Jackson was dead. Her family filled the vacuum around the man they called Uncle Jackson. He lived always in a crowd, wrote James Parton, his earliest scholarly biographer. Martin Van Buren, who served Jackson as Secretary of State and as Vice President, said, "I have scarcely ever known a man who placed a higher value upon the enjoyments of the family circle." As he sat and stewed over South Carolina, the president relied on his nephew Andrew Jackson Donaldson, whom Jackson had raised and hoped might one day succeed him to the presidency, to handle correspondence and visitors. It was the most intimate of arrangements. Donaldson lived with his wife, Emily, and their children in rooms across the hall from the president in the White House, and the Donaldsons were at Uncle's call. Attractive, young, and headstrong, fond of parties but prone to bouts of piety, an ambitious figure in Washington society, Emily Donaldson was Jackson's official hostess. She was a beautiful, accomplished, and charming woman, said her friend Cora Livingston, with wonderful tact and delightfully magnetic manner. Everyone was in love with her. Andrew and Emily Donaldson were joined by Major William B. Lewis, a key Jackson aide and a rival of Andrew Donaldson's for the president's ear. Young people brightened the president's universe, too. There was the pretty Mary Easton, a cousin and intimate of Emily's. The entourage included the portrait painter Ralph Earl, a favorite of the late Rachel Jackson's, who was called the King's Painter and had his own room in the White House. In Washington, this inner circle was augmented by the president's kitchen cabinet, a shifting cast of characters that, depending on who was doing the counting, included Andrew Donaldson, William Lewis, Martin Van Buren, journalists Amos Kendall and Francis Preston Blair, and Roger B. Taney, who served Jackson as Attorney General and Secretary of the Treasury before going on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. A shrewd New York politician, Van Buren, he was known as the Little Magician, was a widower whose lack of domestic obligations enabled him to be with the president as often as the president wished it. Taken all in all, it was an eclectic circle, linked by bonds of affection and roiled by jealousies and rivalries both large and small. It was, in other words, like most families, only this one lived in the White House and shaped the private world of the President of the United States. Ferocious in defense of the people and things he loved, Jackson was equally fierce, and often ruthless, in the pursuit of anyone or anything he believed to be a threat to the world as he saw it. He dominated the times, and the evidence of his strength and the aura of his authority led some to think of him as the Old Lion. To others, he was the Lion of Tennessee. In 1830, Oliver Wendell Holmes published a poem, To a Caged Lion, which captures the awe with which the creatures were regarded. Holmes's lion is the terror of the trembling wild before whom all nature shrunk. For all his vices, and he had many, Jackson refused to accept defeat, either in his own life or in the life of the country. Surrender was unthinkable, for surrender meant an end to the story, and he believed America's story and his own were still unfolding. Jackson's saga would end only when he was buried in the corner of his wife's garden in Tennessee. America's, he insisted, would never end. I for one do not despair of the Republic, he would often say, adding, the Republic is safe. Another aging former president took a dimmer view. My hopes of a long continuance of this union are extinct. John Quincy Adams, the sixth president, who was the son of the second, told his diary. Steadiness of faith was, in the long run, as illuminating and essential as sophistication of thought. The art of leadership required both, as did the nation. Life in the arena was rough and tiring, yet Jackson savored the fight and found solace in the unending work democracy demanded of its champions. I was born for a storm, Jackson once said, and a calm does not suit me. It was a good thing he felt this way, for defending and shaping America was not easy. But for Andrew Jackson, nothing ever had been.